Hello, welcome everyone. We're going to start letting people gradually come into the session. It's just about to go 2:30. If you're here for diversity and procurement, you are in the right place. The point of this session this afternoon, which I've just learned, is the post-lunch and the graveyard session. So we'll try and keep things moving for you. The point of this session, as you start to come in, is to help you find some practical ways to make the procurement process, in whatever way that you're attached to it, more diverse. And that may be about suppliers, that may be about even your team, it may be about things ranging from apprentices through construction to architecture to surveying. Architecture tends to be in the news a lot lately, but it's not the only game in town for sure, and our speakers today will reflect that. And they'll also talk today about some issues around being aware of your local community and trying to make sure that procurement invites people in from the local area. I'm buying a little bit of time now because I'm watching the time go, but I think we're going to make a proper start now. So first of all, welcome everyone. I'm Lisa Taylor. I am your moderator today. We have one loss of person. Chloe Phelps had a work emergency come up, so can't join us, but the fact that she also was working on a competition and is with Brick by Brick, which is a separate part away from Croydon. Nana Aramuke is also with Enfield, and she's run a competition. So we'll have some crossover there. And we also have some private sector organizations in the room. As I say, I'm director of Coherent Cities. What we do is facilitation for cross sector groups, I guess, in terms of people who are going through change, and a little bit of, I guess, presentation coaching there. But I'm also executive director of Future of London, which is my hat today, if you like. That's a network of more than 5,000 urban practitioners, and Nena's actually on our board. One of the things that's really important to us is a speaker diversity network that I co-created back in 2015. It's one of the things I'm proudest of. And it's not only about getting more voices onto stages so that people who are young or who are coming into it or who are looking at changing sectors see and hear people like them on stage. We also, instead of just urging people to have diverse panels, we provide free training for people who do have something to say and just need some confidence and skills. So those things are really important to us. I bring that up partly for promo, but also because I and Future of London, my colleague Nicola Mathers, thought pretty hard about getting involved with this session, because whether you're coming from the procurement side or the diversity side, or both ideally, everyone's pretty much aware of what happened with Southwark's architecture procurement issue this summer. All the best will in the world, technically did all the right things. And in terms of diverse participation, it did not go well. 110 final organizations, no Black-led firms in a borough that has 46% non-white population and 25% Black population. So a big, Now, whether you call that a burning platform, a place to start again, whatever you want to call it, the point is it's time to go again. So I sounded out people across the sector, people who were neutral, people who were angry, and I spoke with Jennifer Castle, who is from LHC and on the panel today, and it was really clear that this is not a PR exercise. This is about actually changing things. And she convinced me, as did the people, even people who were angry at the process, that this is a really good point and the perfect group to sort of say, let's move ahead. How do we do this better? So that's why we're here. And we think that the examples and the insight that people are going to share with you today is the best way forward. There is one framing question for this session, and it's how do we make procurement more inclusive? You're going to hear for about 3 to 5 minutes from each of the people in this group about what they're seeing and what they're doing to make that happen. And then we'll go to a discussion. You're going to get a sneak peek at some sort of forensic look at what's happening in terms of procurement from Claire Benny in a second. But that's kind of the order of the day. Have questions if you want to. The Hoover, I think I'm pronouncing that right. The Hoover platform will allow you to do that. Or you can ask questions here in Q&A. There may be one coming up already. And someone is not getting any sound. So I'm going to ask Salma, who's with LHC, to check that out and see if that can be remedied for that person, or hopefully not everyone. I am now going to hand over to Claire Benny, who is our first speaker. She has done, as I say, some really forensic work on her own time with Excel sheets. I've seen it. It's the back work is really alarming, but the front of it is really impressive also. I'm going to hand to her to tell you what she's been finding. And I think also LHC will be running her slides for her. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Elisa. If I could just have the first slide up, which is the sort of black and white slide, that would be great. So my name's Claire Benny. I was the development director at Peabody. Could we full screen it? Is that possible? Just that little button at the bottom, next one along. Yeah, fantastic, thank you. So I was development director at Peabody, and I did a small practice procurement while I was there, and that's architectural practices, which got some attention at the time, just because it sort of cut through the thicket of some bureaucracy that I experienced as a public authority there. I now advise local authorities on how to do procurement, but also just generally how to do good housing on their land. And I've worked with 6 authorities in London over the last 18 months, and I've really seen the challenges that they've faced at the front line to procure inclusively. Sometimes the bureaucratic processes really do make that difficult. My background's architecture, so my brief talk here, there's 5 slides, is going to be about how public authorities procure architects in particular. Now, this might sound really obvious, but actually good procurement is about both sides. It's always about the buyer and the supplier. And I find that often mistakes happen because no one fully understands both sides of this equation, both parties. And local authorities and architects, you could not get 2 more different kinds of party really in terms of culture, size, nimbleness, and so on. And local authorities, I find, are always looking for entities rather like themselves. And therefore, when they come to procure architects, it's a huge culture shock, and that's what happens. So if we go on to the first slide, what I'd quite like to do is look very quickly at local authorities. This is my sort of very, very high level summary of what happens. You've got the leadership team in a local authority saying, you've got to finish it now, you've got to have no risk, you've got to get those projects done before the next election, you've got to meet the targets and so forth. And what I find with local authorities is 3 key things. One, they're under that pressure, huge pressure to deliver, which might make them procure less well in many ways. Secondly, they're always on a sort of risk appetite journey, really. The left-hand side of what this poor old beleaguered development manager is saying is, I'm really worried actually about doing something wrong, and I just want to finish it quickly. And actually, I'm really focused on residents, quite rightly, so it's got to be done. And actually, sometimes architects design me things that are really impractical, and I just can't see that. And then the development manager could, if the local authorities finished a whole program of stuff, be in a much more sort of sophisticated place in a way and be saying, actually, everybody gets this here, and I can't wait to work with smaller architects because I know exactly how to edit out all their sort of impractical stuff. The other thing about local authorities is they've often got really big sites, but to be honest, over 50% of their sites are usually tiny. And actually, you don't want to go to the supermarket on those occasions. You want to go to your local shop. So food is a very good equivalence here. Sometimes local authorities just can't resist going to the enormous shop when they should be going to the smaller one. So that's the sort of very, very high level profile of what they're like. Now let's look at architects. So that's on the next page. So this is where architects are in London. There are about 1,400 practices around in London. Actually, there's probably more than that, but because there are quite a few architects that aren't chartered with the RIBA necessarily. And 15% of those only have more than 20 staff. So actually, so many architects, 85%, are often cut out of procurement processes simply because they don't have the turnover that's normally required. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more depth in a moment. I want to say that actually very small architects can achieve a lot. What authorities, public authorities sometimes don't understand is that even if you're only on £500,000 turnover, you can actually design 100 homes and do it extremely professionally and work with large scale house builders. And that's something I've experienced personally. So if we go on to the next slide, What I then did was analyse all of the public frameworks that are, or the major ones that is, that are around in London at the moment. The GLA's got one, obviously we all know what that is. We've got 9 housing associations that have got a framework as opposed to a dynamic purchasing system. And of course Southwark's procured a framework also. And what it turns out is that there's 124 practices, sounds quite good on balance, who are on those frameworks, but then you actually analyse, you know, some people are on 9 of them, and actually what it comes out as is 22 architects in London are extremely busy, and that feels like a shame to me. And it's kind of, you know, how can we move on from there? Nothing wrong with any of these architects you can see below, and in fact many people in the room may have heard of many of them. But if we move on to the next slide, I had a quick look at those hot 22. 35 years is the average time that these practices have been around. So we're already sort of into the middle age, as it were, of practice age. And that's, you know, nothing wrong with a bit of experience actually. But the most telling one is on next door to that number 35. There's only one practice out of those hot 22 that has a turnover of under £1.5 million, aka a staff of under 20. And given the kind of sites that local authorities have, actually that's a mismatch. What you've got there is some big practices, 14 of them who've got up to £10 million turnover, and then 7 who've got 10 million plus. And it's very rare that local authority schemes require those people. You do need some of those people. It's a bit like Countdown. You need a couple from the top, 2 from the middle and 2 from the bottom. But actually we need for local authorities far more of that kind of smaller, younger, agile and local practices that fall into that first category, and they can bring some fresh ideas and they can get their directors working. Now, the other thing I did, of course, was to have a look at the makeup of their directors and staff, and the stats, sorry, the pictures are covering them, so let me just move those across. The stats were interesting. 20% have female directors. 30% of those have actually no female directors whatever, and only 8% of these firms, sorry, there are only 8% BAME directors in these firms, my apologies. You then get to the actual staff themselves and you can see the stats there, which are actually quite similar to architects as a whole. And actually what that makes me think is there's a problem with architecture. There is a problem with procurement, obviously, but there's actually a problem with the whole business of architecture and who it attracts and how affordable it is to even study it. And then you get to the killer stat at the bottom, which is what's going on in London. And of course, London has just over half females and 41% BAME. And there may be other people in the room who have more accurate stats than that, but that's the one I found. So my final slide really is just to mention that so many things can go wrong with trying to procure smaller, more bespoke, less kind of obvious organisations. And that can happen just in general, just the cost to bid. It can happen because you put too many parties into the, oh, it's gone, into the mix. It can also happen, is there any chance of getting that slide back? No, okay. It can also just happen because sometimes the questions we ask tip things too much towards the fee or too much towards that turnover thing, which again is just the wrong thing to ask. And of course it can happen because social value and equality and diversity are not given quite enough of a percentage. And when they are given a question, sometimes those questions can be so long and complex that this poor sort of practice with 6 people in it simply can't answer it. So as I mentioned, the issue we have is always around the mismatch between the organisation doing the buying and the architects who are just a completely different size and culture. And that's the problem we're all trying to fix in the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. As I say, there's a lot more to that piece of work, and it would be interesting. It could be carried across different types of professions within the built environment as well. Not asking you to do that, but maybe someone else wants to take it up. And I think we should follow that up when we come to the discussion point, because there's some good things to check in on. I wanted to actually, almost in a response in a way, go to Nena. Nena Arameke's director. I'm always say director. I always give you that extra job, head of development at Enfield, soon to be director, and is in a council dealing with these issues day to day. What are you seeing in your work? And you can respond to Claire if you want to, or just go ahead with your own experience.
Actually, I think I would agree with just about everything Claire said. I think that as for development managers, you've got to manage risk, you've got to manage time and cost, and quality as well. And oftentimes it's easier to just go through a framework. We default to that because you can pick known entities. There's a sense that you always, if it's not a framework, then it's an OJU, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that. Either. If you, like Claire said, most of our programs, we do have fairly large sites, but we also have majority small sites that aren't necessarily OJU level procurements for consultants and services that don't necessarily require that you go to a framework, that you could do with 5 quotes, 3 quotes, or whatever, depending on the value of it. But we do, because we once again are rewarded for risk avoidance, for delivering to time, quality, and cost, that it's safer to go to kind of your known and stable entities. But that does then end up with the picture that Claire so aptly painted of where we are, particularly in our architectural services. But the thing to do, I think that we've been looking at Enfield is, the thing to do with what we've been looking at Enfield is kind of intending to go out to find and make sure that we are getting inclusivity. So we just did a competition, as you mentioned, for intergenerational housing. And one of the things that we were able, we started out saying is that we started out actually saying we wanted SMEs, pretty much like the Southern framework. We said we were going for SMEs, and we had started with the assumption in saying we wanted SMEs that we would therefore be getting an inclusive mix of architects and practices. What did happen, however, is that we ended up with watching what was happening in Southwark. We stopped and asked ourselves the question, are we going to get the level of diversity and inclusivity that we were hoping for? And should we be doing more? So one of the first things we did is actually look at who's there, who else is there? Now, who don't we know and who do we know? So the team went out and did some soft market testing, looked around to see which architects were local to Enfield and beyond, and reached out to them, made them aware that we were going to be going out to competition soon, kind of encourage them to apply when it comes out. We also then looked at how we were doing our pre-selection, so the stage 1 criteria, and we made diversity a criteria. So in terms of how diverse is your workforce, what do you work in diverse communities? So are you, and how diverse is your leadership in particular? And so, we ended up with, over 47 practices, and of which 83% were, from BAME communities. We also had a large percentage of women-led practices and LGBTQ-led practices. And so that kind of, and I don't think we would have achieved that same outcome if we had just said we're going out to small business.
That's a really good point. I mean, this is the discussion that comes up no matter what arena you pursue diversity in. It's work. It's a lot of work on that issue, which is how you and I came to discuss this issue at the Speaker Diversity Network, is who's out there. When I asked you about potential expertise and speakers for a conference back in whatever, and I said, we don't have enough people of color, BAME people, you gave me 6 names and 3 of them had left the sector through no fault of your own because no one knows where anyone is. And I think this is one of the things that has to happen, that competitions are good for. I know there's pluses and minuses to having them, but is finding out who the hell is out there. So congratulations for doing that. And the piece of work, it's finding time and people who can do that for you. Yeah, sure. Thanks, Nena. We'll come back to some of that. Joseph, you were going to get a break after Chloe, but Chloe's not with us, so you could be Chloe if you wanted to, but perhaps best if you just let us know what you're doing within the GLA. What's your work focus on?
Okay, it was interesting that Claire was talking about the failure of an inclusive process, and I think I sort of, not to underpick the whole the EDI agenda, but sometimes I think inclusive processes might be the wrong framing of it. So, and I'll unpack that in a bit in a second. But at the moment, so I manage ADUP. I wasn't involved in the procurement of it, but I will be ultimately responsible for the procurement of the framework that follows the ADUP2. And as part of like scoping that exercise, that future exercise, I guess rather than look at like how do we make the process inclusive, we've looked at from analyzing the barriers of exclusion. So why is it that these processes exclude people rather than how do we include people? Because I think the onus of inclusion is on the person trying to get into a system, and the process of thinking about exclusion is about the institution using their power essentially to open barriers and open doors for people to like participate with us. So we spent a lot of time looking at what the structural barriers are and then thinking about sort of creatively, how do we address those? And that often seems to come back to who's willing to take the risk on this, and at which point does the procurer, so the supplier at this side, take that risk. I think what's interesting about doing a framework for the GLA is that we aren't directly procuring a service at that point. We're procuring to professionals who will be used by other external users and internal users. So if we're not directly procuring services, why make the thresholds to access so high when it's up to each user to responsibly use the framework to address that risk at each project? The point that Claire made about turnover and insurances is like one of the most significant sort of barriers to address. And we've had actually had a meeting, 2-hour meeting today with our procurement team about that issue, which actually got a decent outcome on. Just sort of going through my notes. And then I guess the key thing for us is also setting these as strategic objectives at the upfront, to saying that we want to have a representative framework, saying we want to be showing best practice for public sector procurement, and then being held accountable to those. So stating upfront, what are we being judged on, rather than it being something that comes out at the end. I think having that sort of political leadership to say this is what we're achieving, we're going to state it upfront is going to be important. And then actually we've written a whole supplier diversity action plan specifically for future procurement exercises, which looks at sort of 3 points. One is comms and outreach. So, who is our network? Who are we talking to? So I agree with Nena on that point wholeheartedly. The second is what are we saying to that network? So what information are we providing that's useful to them? And talking to practices based on their scale. It's very hard to have the same conversation with a practice of 5 people about access to a framework and a practice of 105. It's a different conversation, and the responsibility is different. And then also debunking myths often around inclusive procurement. So this idea that in order to have a more diverse or representative framework, you have to somehow lose quality. I think we need to debunk that myth as well. Like a lot of very prominent, highly successful architectural exports are people from diverse backgrounds and have been for a very long time, So practices like Zaha Hadid, obviously internationally renowned, architects like Farshid Nasari, David Adjaye, Asif Khan. There's lots of very well-known sort of architects, prominent architects from diverse backgrounds. And then I guess a key part as well that we're looking at as part of the action plan is ensuring representation on the client side. So who's evaluating them and sort of what are they expecting from the framework? And those are strategic objectives, a very useful way of saying, well, actually, this is your role in moderating and evaluating is to help us meet these strategic objectives around quality, innovation, representation, things like that. And then another thing that I've spent a lot of time thinking about is the quirks of architecture against other public procurement exercises. I think Claire's slide where she said, most architectural practices are micro enterprises or small enterprises. So often our procurement colleagues are very focused on SMEs. Then when we did a desktop study, 85% of our existing framework are SMEs. That's because an SME is a very large business for an architect. An SME is 250 people below. There are not very many architects below that. So we have to come up with a different sort of values of what is a small practice and create almost a new language around that. And luckily, the European Union provides very good, actually breaks down SME into medium, small, and micro enterprises. That's a very useful tool when it comes to sort of thinking about who you're trying to get on the framework. And then yeah, that's it actually. There's no and then. That's where I'm going to stop. I don't want to go on for too long.
And then we do it. And then, yeah, we do
Well,
it.
yeah, and then actually that was my final thing, is that like a lot of the work has to be, or is, not something that you can promote. And that's not like to say that you're not doing it in a direct way, but I think there's a temptation that somehow there's a PR exercise in inclusive procurement. But actually, I think when done well, it's not creating separate spaces. You're actually embedding diverse practitioners into the mainstream of procurement. And that's what I mean about not an inclusive process, but non-exclusionary process, where people are able to access and participate in procurement without additional barriers to them, which are both could be financial, but often it's actually cultural and behavioral. They're the barriers that are like important to overcome.
Great. Thanks so much for that. I've got a bunch of questions that I've been making notes for. So when we get to discussion, I've got a few for all of you, and we'll come back and maybe dig into some of that afterwards if we can. Yemi, I'm going to come to you next. You have been supplier side, you're now client side with the Housing Association. What's your experience been, and what are you able to do?
Yeah, so I wholeheartedly agree with a lot of as what have been said already. So procurement, sourcing and quality management really does drive top line sustainability. It drives performance, it drives profitability and a good quality product. And that really is what we're all aspiring for. Procurement is also really important because it really does set the tone and the direction of the relationship between all actors in any given project. As an industry, we need to drive innovation, and innovation in productivity, innovation in sustainability. To achieve this, we really do need to start with procurement. So just following the same business as usual models or the tried and tested methods, or using the same suppliers and the consultants, does not mean that you're going to get the best outcome. And it certainly does not lead to the most innovative outcome. I think we do need to be braver. Often it's thought that if we do things differently or more innovatively, that automatically means that there's going to be increased risk, and risk is something that a lot of the speakers have already touched on. And we don't often weigh potential risks with the often significant rewards that are achievable. Now, construction's full of risks, but we still build. We have no choice but to. Therefore, I think we need to do better at acknowledging the risks, stress testing them, and putting mitigations in place to deal with them, so that should those risks come to fruition, you know, we're covered. I think we shouldn't be so adverse to risk that it stops us from being progressive. And I think that is something we see a lot at the moment. In terms of some other practical things we could do, I think we need to proactively go out to find the groups that we're looking to target. In situations where, you know, we might want to encourage collaboration, for example, between more established and firms or SMEs to work with emerging firms, I think we need to change the language of the ask. So rather than encouraging, maybe we're mandating. We could also look at things like, and this has been touched on already, insurance and PI on a project by project basis, rather than a blanket demand on the levels required, to ensure that what's being requested is suitable for the specific project we want to tender for. And similarly for turnover and thresholds, I think we could look more at the requirements for those and being more creative depending on the project size and scope. Probably to illustrate that point, to quote from a Guardian article that Bola and I, amongst others, contributed to in July this year. It was written by Ollie Wainwright, and it had a very poignant contribution from a leading human rights lawyer who gave the following example of having tender requirements that only accept architectural practices that have been established for maybe, I don't know, 15 years, or have completed projects of a certain value. And those requirements superficially seem non-discriminatory in terms of race or gender. But if you look at the demographics of architectural practices, it doesn't take you long to see that those types of requirements will exclude a majority of Black and Asian or women-led practices, as Claire's infographic showed. So even though on the face of things, certain criteria might appear to be race neutral or gender neutral, when you actually test them against the demographics of the industry, they do have a discriminatory effect. I also think, and this point was also touched on earlier, that we really need to scrutinise what practices say that they're doing in terms of EDI. So it doesn't just continue to be a tick box exercise. It's not good enough to just have a policy. We need to be asking for evidence of their approach. Do they have diverse leadership and employee models? What is their recruitment approach? How have they worked with those in the communities that they're operated in? I also think that for up and coming practices and those generally that have had very little luck in, with the existing procurement systems, we could look at providing some sort of insight, mentoring or workshops. And this is something that LHC has done very recently, and that was very well received, where knowledge was shared on what the tenderer is looking for, hits and tips on how to submit successful applications, pitfalls to watch out for, how the process works in very practical terms. So removing some of the smoke and mirrors that exist in the system. So I think that there's a lot we can do to make the system more inclusive. It's about a genuine willingness to do so, as opposed to not having the ability to achieve it. It's possible and it isn't difficult. We just really need to want to do it.
Agreed. Thank you. So there's a critical mass coming of very practical things that can be done across the piece. One thing, kind of outside of this world, but in terms of procurement, an associate that many of you will know, who's an architect who's quite innovative, said that they kept being used as bid candy because they were doing something quite different, and they get put on a big bid with the developers, like, oh, we'll work with so-and-so, and nothing was actually meant to happen of it. And that cannot happen. I think the idea of not just having a policy, having action is absolutely critical. So thanks for that. Jennifer, I'm going to come to you. So you were in the thick of the Southwark thing. You are fixing it to the best of your ability. But to say, in talking with you, I really got a very strong sense that you really do want to change this, and figuring out what the hell went wrong, or what happened, and how to make that not happen again. What are you guys doing now?
Thanks, Lisa. Great. It's been really great to listen to you, because a lot of what you've been saying are things that we've been discovering through our discovery phase since we started to look at, as you say, fixing something that happened. I do want to say that I'm representing LHC. I'm the procurement partner that worked alongside Southwark. We work really closely with Southwark, but I'm talking on behalf of LHC, not necessarily on behalf of Southwark, although we are working very closely with them about the solutions that we're putting forward. I'm in complete agreement with a lot of the things that have been said. What I will say, and this isn't a defensive notion at all, but a lot of these barriers that we identified at the beginning, we took the same approach. We identified some outcomes, we looked at what those barriers could be, and we tried to remove them the best of our ability. And a lot of that included financial thresholds across the board. We created a new lot which had a turnover cap even, so big organisations couldn't come in. We allow case studies to span over 7 years, and they can belong to the individual and not to the firm. We accepted built, we accepted unbuilt. We did a lot of effort around this kind of objective around SMEs, but it wasn't enough. This is the thing. We looked at it, and the reason it is that we didn't define an outcome specifically enough around having a diverse workforce, which it was there, it was in there, it was in the criteria, but the criteria wasn't specific enough around it. And that is very clear to us. That's where we fell down. 110 practices, not one is black-led, and it was primarily developed in Southwark Council. It's not a great statistic, it's horrific. Everybody was really disappointed with it, which was a shame, because we were really proud of some of the practices that we did manage to capture, which were really small organisations that don't have access to public sector work. But as I say, it wasn't necessarily enough. Well, it definitely wasn't enough. What we're looking to do now is, and we've got a couple of projects, and some of you will have heard this already, we are looking to expand on the current architect design services framework. And we're looking to do it in such a way that we retain the integrity and the quality of it, and create an equal path to create a more diverse panel. what we're doing is we're going out to another procurement, and actually we are going to combine the two frameworks so that we end up with one list at it. We're not going to drop the quality criteria because we don't see that that's necessary. We're not saying that we need to compromise on criteria. But we are evaluating, exactly as we've spoken about this afternoon, around EDI credentials, lived experience, how that they are applying that in policy. We've tweaked the criteria. We're a lot more flexible around case studies, and we are marking and evaluating that criteria around EDI. That's one part of it. That's one part of what we're doing to try and to capture and to remove some of those barriers that we hadn't identified beforehand, which are absolutely definitely there, that we needed to look a little bit further into it. The other really important thing, and Yemi mentioned that we held some sessions over the last couple of weeks. These are things that we haven't publicised because we've done some very, very target market engagement. And I think that's really important for people to look at what their key outcomes want to be. And in this case, we do want to increase the Black-led firms and the BAME-led firms on the framework. It is a key outcome. And we've done a lot of talking to firms that fit within that category, understanding what the difficulties are, understanding what those barriers have been, and then offer as much support as we possibly can to say, what is it that we're actually looking for and how can we evaluate it? So it's something that we're in the throes of at the moment. We've got a proposal. We're pretty confident through speaking to some people that are in the room at the moment, but also to wide networks to see how we can do this. And that's step one. The other thing that we're introducing with the ADS expansion is the notion of what we're calling at the moment a talent pool. It might change names. We haven't quite decided yet. But what that's saying is that we're only looking to appoint maybe 11 to 20 new firms to this expansion to then combine lists. But this talent pool will capture all of this fantastic talent that isn't quite ready for public sector work because they haven't yet got all of the experience. And those authorities that aren't willing to take the risk, they've still got exposure to them there. And we will offer coaching and mentoring and networking opportunities to them over the coming years while we're working on it. That's with ADS. I can talk a bit later perhaps about how we're going to apply this also into a multidisciplinary consultancy services framework, because although we do see that architecture is a very it's a very nuanced kind of profession, but across the consultancy services, the same challenges still apply. And there are still smaller firms that don't have access. The same barriers do apply. So it is something that we're looking to put forward. But I'm really glad to hear everybody saying this, because it's feeding into what we're doing, and it shows us that we're kind of on the right track.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good points made, and I think there'll be some questions coming from that. Bola, I hope you appreciate the segue she gave to practices other than architecture, because there are some. Do you want to sort of introduce yourself, and what are you doing? What are you hearing from what's just come out of this session?
Well, first of all, thanks for the invitation. It's just remarkable hearing some of these comments, because, you know, I'm talking to the wrong people, basically. You know, everyone on this call gets it. Right? And the public sector generally doesn't get it, which is why Southwark happened. But what I want to do to contextualize where I am at the moment is attempt to give you a 26-year lived experience in 3 to 5 minutes. Now, I'm a management consultant, chartered quantity surveyor, and chartered construction manager. I've also been a strategic supplier to the public sector for 15 years. So my journey with supply diversity began in August 2000 on the back of my first business trip to Atlanta, Georgia. And in Atlanta, Georgia, they have a tool and an instrument, a legislative instrument called set-aside contracts, where they are actively trying to engender minority participation, whether it's female-led, African-American-led, Latino, Hispanic, etc. They have a tool that's mandated every year to achieve a number of different outcomes, most of which is financial. but there's a huge social value piece attached to that, which is why it has been successful in many ways. It's contentious, I know that, but I raised that for a reason, because our UK equivalent is pretty much at best the Section 106 instrument. And it was the combination of understanding what the set aside was trying to do in the US and what the Section 106 should be doing in the UK. That's what inspired me to set up Urbanist in 2003 as a construction manager, getting involved with framework contracts, largely repairs and maintenance, and working in a subcontract and tier one capacity for public sector landlords. But the question, and I said I want to challenge the sector. The question I put to all of you on the call and all the participants listening is, what does or what could great procurement actually look like from a tangible perspective? And you've all answered it so well in terms of your individual aspirations and projects, initiatives, etc. So I've come up with as I do, I love a hashtag. I love an acronym. I've come up with a hashtag that's called Public Sector Ammo, right? And I'm going to show you what I'm talking about. I hope you can all see that. So there's a couple of seconds to just work out what I'm trying to say. But what I want to do, I'll go through each letter to kind of build on what I'm trying to say here. And the whole purpose behind the public sector ammo is that literally the public sector contracting authorities and practitioners need to equip themselves with the right tools. So to the letter A, and we've discussed this, it's access. What does access look like within the context of the public sector equality duty? And that's the elephant in the room, really. Where are the access points? Where do you communicate them? Where do you advertise? How do you engage? How do you procure the specifications around access and engagement? And specifically in the context of minority-owned businesses, because Southwark only happened because the access was there, but the door was the wrong size. The door maybe didn't even have hinges. It had a handle, and maybe on your one side of the door. It had all these different functionalities, but what isn't happening with regards to access is they're assuming, and they being the public sector, are assuming that one size fits all, and it doesn't. It clearly doesn't. And I'm saying that from a lived experience basis and premise. And so given that the access may be challenging, the next question is the M, the first M. The first M is where I get excited, because M relates to contract management. This is about, you've done a procurement and you're assuming you've got the best people on board. You're now managing the contract itself. And this is where you really begin to identify the value of or success of your procurement. And for me personally, I think the public sector, beyond procurement, you almost need to define the outcome before you carry out the procurement. And regrettably, the biggest example of where this has failed is Brentford. So in the midst of us trying to get procurement right, we need to think about the outcomes first. And to do that well, I think we need to engage some digital business models to understand exactly what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what kind of outcomes we really want to achieve. And I think digital twins and smart contracts have a role in that to play. I think if you begin to open up your supply chain and suppliers to the concept of how you will be monitoring and managing them, including using things like digital twins and smart contracts, I think you'll begin to engage in a different way. And this is not restricted to size of firm. It's about the level of innovation within the firm. Then I go into the M and O, which is basically the measurement of the opportunity. And this is where the key metrics really kick in. Again, I talk about defining the outcomes before you procure. And to do that well, you may begin to by default, engender and approach a fully representative supply chain if you're talking about things like local area participation. This is where the minority participation conversation kicks in, but you really restrict it to your local area. And defining local area in itself has become an art. But particularly for housing clients, another metric or measurement could be, for example, CDM compliance. You know, which of your supply chain members, given that they become a designer under the rules, how competent are they with regards CDM compliance? This is, you know, another elephant in the room scenario. Again, in the presence of the looming building safety regulator and on the back of the Dame Hackett review, we really need to talk about, actually, it's not just your technical prowess we're interested in. We're interested in everything else around you as a business and how you collaborate with other firms regardless of size. So that's just some key metrics I think that we can build into the procurement process that aren't exactly about the stage 1, stage 2 criteria. This goes beyond that. And again, it comes back to my point about defining the outcomes well before you begin the process. Now, just last month, I shared a panel at Harms England. And on that panel was the board member and champion for equality and diversity, Olivia Scanlon. And we both agreed that the public sector themselves, they need to disrupt themselves and explore, maintain, and maybe even invest for the longer term around the diversity of thought piece. And the diversity of thought piece is what was missing in the London Borough of Southwark debacle. Now, my view is, if we begin to do some of what we've all discussed better, then perhaps we can resign what happened in Southwark to history for good. And actually, on the back of what I've heard for the last 45 minutes, I'm actually, I'm quite optimistic that we can do that and do that well. So I'll leave it there for now, but let's engage with the conversation.
Thanks for that. I think for the notes, we now have an acronym. We've got a bunch of lists. We're going to send everyone off from this conference and from Future of London's resource page with like I could do all these things. And this is quite straightforward, which people who like detail will love. And I think it's very useful. It's worth acknowledging. I mean, I've had a look at the participants and I recognize a few who are very much on side with this. Bala was kind of, I think, suggesting that in a sense, in some ways we're preaching to the choir, but there are people out there who know that, God, I have to do this. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to do it. And maybe they're coming at it from purely business reasons. If they get there, that's okay. That's the result. And I think there's one question I would ask. Actually, I'll ask it to Bala now. I was going to wait for a while, but this conference is about public sector, but why only public sector? We need to be talking to private sector as well in terms of making these decisions, some of whom are, of course, the architecture practices we're talking about, or the surveying firms. What about the private sector? Just maybe a brief question about that.
Well, actually, in many ways, the private sector has led on this, but I think the common denominator from my other panelists is that the risk and interpretation of risk, preparedness for risk, interpretation of risk, valuing of risk, all of these things that revolve around the word called risk means actually we're going to stick with what we know because we're nervous about trying new things. So unless the clients themselves become better informed about what their fear of the risk actually is from a tangible operational level, we will never move away from where we are at the moment, which is a model that is dysfunctional. And it really is. If we are honest with ourselves and we look at the landscape of successful businesses currently delivering, whether it's architectural, surveying, multidisciplinary, you have large businesses in there that are displacing micro businesses, but yet calling on micro businesses to become part of their supply chains. So the value proposition from the micro business who's in the local area, who's more than capable, is excluded because the model says you're too small and you're risky. So we need to unpack what that actually means. The buddying system, which works well in the US, for example, is one way of getting there quickly. But in actual fact, if you repackage procurement lots, for example, in a slightly different way, and maybe attach more incentivizations for payment and all the rest of it, you will begin to see that the private sector model, which is largely about mitigation of risk, not removal, mitigation of risk, it's something that the public sector is loath to do, but now calling upon because they recognize actually you get slightly different, more innovative outcomes. And without having that confidence to move in a slightly different direction, nothing's going to change. Nothing.
You're absolutely, thank you. And actually, remembering Yemi was saying the same thing about there's risk already. We accept certain amounts of risk already, accept some here. So get over that. And I'm gonna ask Claire just to follow up. The last thing, I'll leave the private sector alone after that. And anyone else wants to step in, but I do think there's a role there. Claire, you've worked across the fence in a way. Any thoughts on this in terms of what you've been looking at lately? Unmute.
Thoughts on the private sector piece, or, I mean, one thing I've started to do, and I hope I succeed in it, is somehow to make the supply chain for anybody, whether they're private or public, more visible. I think it's extraordinary that if I'm in the public sector in particular, I press a procurement button over here and I literally can't see what's going to happen. And then a spreadsheet pops out at the end. So one of my slightly crazed, but I hope valuable projects is actually putting together an entire directory of everyone that exists that could fulfill the work, whether they're small, large, and actually just trying to find everyone who's out there and making them visible to the procuring entity, whether public or private. And, you know, what I really hope I'm going to be able to do is actually have sliders on the side, which kind of say, do you have BAME directors? Do you have female directors? What about your staff? What's your plan, etc.? And you can, as the procuring authority, go, I want this, 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 and this. And it actually kind of comes out with a soft market test of actual suppliers who are out there. Watch me and see if I go bonkers doing it and fall over. But I feel like, strangely, I mean, lawyers don't do this. Lawyers have actually got two sets of directories, one called Chambers and Co. and one called the Legal 500. And it just makes the whole supply chain visible. And I think what it would also do is encourage architects to look at their rating and go, actually, we look quite embarrassing on this directory. We better sort ourselves out. So it's kind of teaching each side about the other.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. And again, I say because of the work that I do is always cross-sector, and I think people, professionals and practitioners go back and forth fairly often. So I do think it's worth discussing it, but I'm going to leave that alone, come back to public now. Any one of you feel free to step up on your points. I have follow-up questions based on what you've just said. And I would say to the audience out there, if you want to ask questions, there's a Q&A function here in Zoom. There's one sort of outside the room in Huva. This is probably pronounced completely wrong, but anyway, you're welcome to do both and send us some questions. Nena, I will come to you because we've had this quite long and useful, all useful list of things that can be done. You're in a place with, I'm imagining, as always, an overworked team with not much time and perhaps a procurement department that you don't hang out with for coffee. What needs to happen? And I want to get into that bit too, that relationship between internal client and procurement department. But what needs to happen for someone like you to absorb all of this? Is it possible?
I think yes. I think it is happening. It starts with that relationship with your procurement team. I think it's actually them being good enablers for the outcomes you're trying to achieve. And I think I'm fortunate to have a very good procurement team now, I think, who get it and have pointed out, for example, that, you know, if a contract is over, it's under owed you, you know, just 3 quotes. Yeah, you pick them and go out to them. There's nothing stopping you. And so they are very supportive. And I think the issues that have been touched upon around insurance and turnover is that needs to be sorted in terms of managing that risk. And we need to move from risk avoidance to risk mitigation, and more of that. You know, so I think that we are heading in that way. Also, I think someone said about debunking the myth that somehow being inclusive means that you are foregoing quality in any way. So I don't think that quality standards in any way need to change, because and whether it's architects, surveyors, or even down to your contractor, I think that, you know, you should aim for very good quality, and there are people who are able to supply that. But it's about access. and it's about how you make access possible. And I think, how do we go about doing it? We need to intend it. It's not going to happen on its own. I think that what the lesson for me has been that you've got to actively intend it to happen. You've got to be very proactive. And that's in every aspect, from your, your pre-qualification, from your soft market testing, from when from actually even before that, from your scheme outcomes. When you're designing your scheme before you even go out to market, you've got to intend it. You've got to intend for your scheme to reflect your local community that you're building for, because at the end of the day, what we want are products that reflect and enable communities, and the way you get that is through having every voice as part of its production. So if you've got a largely middle class, college educated, whatever voice this is, and most and you're designing for a low income community, no matter how hard you try, you're going to miss a trick. So it's having that diversity of voice. It's having, and so if you start intending it from that point, and then you intend it through how you design your procurement and how you roll out the procurement itself, and then you intend it in your brief. So that's to how you're briefing your client, and some of the things that that Bolov talked about, like that risk versus quality, the outcomes, CDM compliance, all the things that from your employees, agents, your QS, your clock of works, all of that. You need diversity. So we're talking about architects a lot, but there are other consultants and contractors that we need to think about the importance of having diversity and inclusivity in those trades as well, if you want to get a good outcome.
Absolutely agreed. There's that point that's come up. I think a few of you brought it up about the client side diversity. No matter who that client is, it's critical. Yemi, you were nodding at that. I think, were one of the ones who brought up the point about potentially mandating things, being intentional as part of that. If you want to address those, great. And I also wanted to ask you as a follow-up, I mean, you're with the Housing Association. Is there anything that you can do differently to kind of push things along, do you think?
So I think, following up from that, quite interestingly, we need to look at very carefully at procurement and where the function of procurement sits within organizations. So a good number of organizations do not have an independent procurement team. We certainly don't at Isha because of our scale. So in those sorts of organizations, who monitors, who directs, and who actions? In my mind, I think we need a combination of approaches. So again, here again with my mandating, but I think that the mandate should come from top down, so development directors, etc., downwards. But I think action needs to be, things need to be action from bottom up, those managing and leading projects who are on the front line and engaged in all the nuances of the project. So hopefully we meet somewhere in the middle.
Okay, I was typing to Joseph saying I'm coming to you next, but you beat me to it. In the same way, when you talked about top down in a way, and it also this question that's come up again repeatedly about leadership bravery and political bravery and will and so forth. I mean, certainly a huge proponent in the current mayor of London. I mean, Joseph, from the GLA's perspective, looking across the broad piece, I'm actually going to ask you all later, so have a think about this. How long will this take? But I'm not going to ask you that yet. What can you guys do in terms of the GLA? You've got the you've got the procurement framework there. What are the testing limits of power in terms of what you guys can do?
I mean, a lot of this is about, as we said at the beginning, is ensuring that you get endorsement from the politicians who ultimately are accountable to their constituents on this, and ensuring that it's a political priority, which it is for the mayor and for the GLA. Which is quite an awkward time because I'm in the process of putting together a procurement strategy. We can't talk about it publicly, about what's in it. So sorry if it seems like I'm ducking details.
We said, like, is it good? Can we do that?
The ambitions of the procurement strategy are in line with what we're aiming to achieve for the Good Growth by Design program. the timescale is an interesting one because I think that there's no reason to not see action quite soon. I think I've met with quite a lot of like regen officers in my role in the area team, and they've said, you know, there's no reason why you have to overcomplicate your own procurement processes when you only need to go to 3 people. So there's a culture, I guess, of not many people versed in the commissioning necessarily know procurement in that much detail. And I think the more that commissioners understand the levers and the actual rules around procurement, the better, because often you can do a lot more than you think you can within the existing system when you're working on. A lot of the projects that we work on, we fund are relatively small. They're like a couple of £1 million here and there, £500,000, 800,000, but that's still really valuable experience for small practices to get their foot into working with the public sector, because it's about the culture, understanding the language. When SSQ comes out, do you know what's being inferred from the questioning? Are you aware of how to answer questions? You know, there's a whole sort of building capacity. I think the bit that's, the thing that keeps me up at night, I was up at 3 o'clock this morning actually worrying about this, is the profession, the state of architecture as it is the biggest risk to our ability to procure equitably. And what I mean by that, I would be interested to know how many of the 1,200 practices in London are Black or Black owned or BAME owned, and what kind of work do they have currently? And therefore, when you're starting a procurement process now, which is requiring experience of, you know, cultural civic buildings, workspace buildings, you know, are we, you know, what actual numbers can we actually get? So one of the things that we want to do is actually capture diversity of the people that apply at SSQ stage. So we can tell from the very beginning, is it even possible based on who's bid to have a representative framework? Like fundamentally, what we're talking about, and if not, what do we do then? You know, what ultimately, if for example, we do the call out and the number of people who apply for the practice from minority backgrounds couldn't even fit the representation of London on a framework, what do we do next? I think there's a question there now.
I think I'm going to go to Jennifer on this. This is a whole sort of mute conversation of people nodding and Claire's getting more figures up and stuff. There is something about asking clients to do that. If you were hiring, you'd have to go again. You'd have to reframe your ask and go again. So in the same way, we need to be doing that. Jennifer, you wanted to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to back up what Joseph's saying there. I think that we didn't ask that data when we were asking for applications at SQ. And so then when we came to looking at, you know, it's clearly a big problem, but how much have we failed? We couldn't measure. We couldn't measure it because we simply didn't get that data. So it is something that we're doing now. And I'm sure we've spoken to the GLA as well, and they've spoken about it too. Collecting that EDI data is really important about the types of firms that you're attracting. Just a quick word on mandating as well. Sitting from a framework provider, we're obviously trying to get as many of these companies onto the framework as we possibly can, but ultimately the real objective is to get them work, right? They need to get some work, and we're trying really hard to encourage people to include their EDI credentials within their assessment. We at LHC, in terms of the ADS expansion, we are going to mandate that at call off they ask an EDI question. That is going to be part of our thing, and it's not about an EDI policy. We don't want to see an EDI policy. We want to make sure that people are asking the right kind of experience-based questions. But I do know that Southwark Council are taking that a slight step further when it comes to call off, because they're looking very much about the scheme deliverables and what the scheme's required. And it's something that we're trying to do now, but it's always really difficult to mandate something across the board to clients. But you've got to demonstrate this through people trying first and then proving that it works and getting out there, and they've got to take some risk and just crack on and do it. And I think that we'll see some of that from Southwark. We're certainly going to see that from Enfield, as we've heard, and with the case studies that are going to emerge from this are going to be very helpful.
Thanks. I think one of the things too that Chloe said, so I had a prep call with Chloe Phelps, and one of the things she said, and I think Yemi, you might have said this as well, is you're not going to get this right away, but just start and do it. And maybe it's not, maybe a competition's not appropriate and you should be able to go in other ways, but it will give you other things like finding more people. The thing I wanted to ask you, Jennifer too, was just this question of, if you've got a client who is, you know, as Enfield might be, or any public sector client of any time, stretched, under-resourced, freaked out about money and risk and so on and so forth, and maybe it's their first council-led housing project and they're really, really nervous. What's the best way to make that case? Is it something that is coming down the pipe? Is it examples? I'll throw this open. I'll ask you first, but I'm going to throw open the question to everyone. So how do you convince them?
Well, coming from someone who talks to clients daily about these things, it's not easy. It's not easy, and there are varying appetites across. People like the idea, but a lot of them don't want to be the first to put into action. I'm not here to push frameworks. Frameworks aren't always the answer, but at least through this process, you've got some security in that there's already been a robust process that's been put forward in place. So that's helpful, particularly stretched organizations that don't have procurement departments that are necessarily competent. I noticed Bola earlier mentioning that some procurement departments aren't completely competent at these things. That is why using a framework like this is really important. That's why we were so passionate about getting it right. Same with the ADUP, because we should be supporting people's objectives through this activity. We're not here just to stick another framework in there. It's to us to help increase that and to make sure that these buildings are being built with this in mind. So I think examples are going to be the case. Support, demonstrating, and you know, Claire, your that data is always going to be incredibly helpful when it comes to demonstrating success and actually the enormity of the issue.
Thanks. Well, the success and also the shortcomings. Claire, just not sure the audience can see the chat. Did you want to restate the stats you've just found? And then Bola, you were nodding. I'll come to you next. So Claire.
Sure. So my data is not by any stroke finished, but I've got quite a lot of data now. And I think there are probably about 80% of London firms with no BAME directors whatever. The tip top 22 that seem to get all the public sector work have about 60% with no BAME directors. And if you're talking about, you're wanting a firm that's purely BAME led, I would say that's in the tens out of those 1,100, not percent, just actual.
Okay, thanks for that. Dark stats, we can work on some of this stuff, definitely. There are always two. The other thing I'll say briefly too, when we first set up this session, we were also, we did invite someone who's representative of the disability community. We were looking at other aspects as well. There are women on this call, there's people who are younger, work in smaller practices. We are looking at this across the piece, but as Nena said, when we talk, this is the house that's burning right now. So we're dealing with this now, but I think all of us in this room and beyond are very aware that these are issues that go beyond architecture and beyond also Black-led issues, but you've got to start somewhere. So this is really worthwhile. Bola, you were nodding at what Jennifer was saying. What did you want to add? Or it made nothing.
I've been nodding from the beginning of this conversation because all of these fantastic panelists are the wrong people for me to be convincing or talking to, but you know, we're sharing a platform, which is great. Just a couple of things. Generation. Material change, a generation. 26 years in, nothing's happened. So I'm saying 2050, ideally, when we standardize our risk-averse approach to diverse supply chains. I'm just putting that out there. And to substantiate that, I don't think frameworks are the way to go, because frameworks themselves are not a guarantee of work. They are a guarantee for you to be in the fashion show for work, but they're not a guarantee of work. And a lot of people don't recognize that either. Now, to your point about bid candy, I could go on and on and on about that. And that really alludes to the risks associated with the buddying system or the supply chains themselves, where you are convinced as a procurer that your tier ones will have a diverse supply chain by definition of them referencing maybe local businesses or BAME-led operations, etc. But the question is, do you measure and monitor the outcomes? This is, you know, I'm saying it as a quantity surveyor on the one hand, but on the other hand, I'm saying, how can you measure your performance yourself? You know, you need those metrics to define and shape future procurement. And public sector bodies aren't doing that well. I think the point around inspiring clients to take the leap of faith, you know, let me contextualize it like this. I'm at the top of my game as a professional. But if I'm in a micro business with 2 years experience, I'm not good enough. apparently. But I can jump into someone else's supply chain and deliver for them under their banner. So we need to think about how we shape lots and how we restrict maybe larger businesses, SMEs. Bad definition. State clearly you want micro businesses, less than 10 staff, make it clear. And then start to apply quotas of excellence. Look at the owners of the business. Look at what they've done. Look at what they've achieved. Look at where they've worked. That is a barometer of what they can do as a practitioner under the guise of an LLP or a limited company. But that doesn't mean that they're not as good as the directors or partners of the top 22. So we really need to readdress and reappraise risk. It all comes back to risk. And I say that affectionately because to some, risk is insulting. It's just like, we're not going there. Don't care what you say. The business case, great, reads well, not interested. And we need to just change that whole narrative around what do we really want to achieve as an outcome? Let's define the outcome first and then procure.
Agreed. Very good point. Thanks for that. I think one of the things about the idea of people sort of leaving to go on their own, I mean, Claire's done it, I've done it. I think you may have been independent at some point. There are a lot of people out there who've come from somewhere that's good and you're sort of bringing things out, and it can be hard to make a name. If you have other lack of visibility, double, triple the difficulty in doing anything like that. But there must be ways. Okay, so Bala actually answered that question that I sort of mooted a little bit earlier about how long do you think this will take? He's saying 2050 until parity. What do you, is anyone thinking that? Nod if you think it's going to take that long, or shake your head if you think we can do this faster.
I was hoping next Christmas.
so next Christmas for Joseph. Nana, what were you going to say?
I think we can start faster. Now, how long it will take us to get to where we can look at procurement and say we're perfect? Probably never, if we're looking for perfect, but we can get pretty darn close. I hope not 20 years. No, so, but I think we can start tomorrow. With the next thing we're doing, we can intend our outcomes, and we can design our procurements to match that intention, and work through to make sure that we actually achieve it. And like Bala said, we have to measure it. It has to be measurable as well, because that's how you can be assured that you're actually going to get what you aimed for.
Yeah. Very good point. I'm going to give the sort of final comment to Jennifer, but before I do that, Yemi, did you want to add anything on that point of how long is this going to take? What's it going to? Oh, you're on mute.
I think I agree with what has been said. I think that we have to put systems in place now. Humans have a very short memory and short attention span. So all of this is in fashion now to talk about wanting to diversify and make things more inclusive. But if the systems are not in place now and people that are passionate about progressing these things, leave, then people forget about things. So I do think we need things in business plans, and we need things kind of just there, irrespective of whoever is leading. If not, I think we could come around to another 20, 25 years, as Bola's alluded to. He's seen it, done it, worn the t-shirt, where we're having this very same conversation again.
Yeah, there's a point too, because, obviously climate change is coming up the agenda for political attention and for the attention of cities and projects and so forth, and spend in the public sector. It may be that some, tornado hits London or something like that, and things start to shift. So watch for that. Claire, I was going to ask you, yes, you can add a quickie. Go for it. Unmute. Yeah.
I was just going to say it needs to come from the supply chain themselves as well. So just thinking about architecture, because that's kind of my pet subject, and apologies to Bola for just kind of going on about that rather a lot. But there's three things I think that's going on. One is there's a new RIBA inclusion charter where they're getting practices to sign up to whole plans to kind of just turn themselves around and encourage a more diverse workforce within their own organizations. So that's a good thing. Another one is, frankly, sometimes architects can be very bad at designing very practical buildings for the public sector, and they could do with a lot of help actually just going to housing academy for a while, and actually just really learning the nitty-gritty of how to do it more practically. And there was one other thing which I've very conveniently forgotten, but I think we need to really look to architects and architecture as a business to help itself change. I know what it was. When I qualified as an architect, I think 11% of architects were female. The quantity is now 33, so it does show that things move on, but at the risk of giving my age away, what's that, sort of 30-ish years, no, not that much, Claire, 20 years, and we've seen a threefold increase in female architects. So things can change, but it does take a while.
All right, thanks for that. Joseph, did you want to leave it with by next Christmas, or do you want to say something more pithy and deep than that? I'm happy with that.
Well, no, I think the idea of having a procurement system that has tried to deliver by this time next year is something we're aiming to do at City Hall. That's the aim. And we will be announcing something next month to start that process. So, but yeah, I think it's interesting, that whole history repeating. I remember my mum worked in regeneration and commissioning, and until last year was the last person to commission a black architect to deliver major public housing regeneration scheme on Angel Town in Brixton, and it took another 20-something years for inner city borough to commission another black practice to deliver public housing scheme.
That's a lot of years. That's way too many years, but he's going fine. Jennifer, I'm going to come to you. The question of how long it takes, but again, just because you were talking about some quite practical things, maybe remind people what's what, and then I'll come back and just say what next steps will be for everyone.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'm really just going to echo what Joseph's saying. We work in the same arena. We have a platform and we have a requirement to act now. That doesn't mean we're going to fix it now, but that does mean we should try something now with action rather than just talk. We're fully committed to doing that. We've got the ADS expansion where the contract notice will be going out at the end of November. We've been engaging with architects about that. We're designing that criteria now, and that product should be live mid next year. We're allowing ourselves lots of evaluation time, which will be a full expanded list of the architects that are already on ADS at the moment. We are engaging with the multidisciplinary consultancy environment at the moment to try and embed our learnings into that to see what we can do. And that will be delivered over 2 phases over the next year. But I want to say we're doing this now. We feel like we're on the right track, but we're not fixing anything. It's not going to be, an overnight thing. It's something that we just want to get out there, try, get a product working, get people commissioned, get people building, get people surveying, get all of this underway through what we're trying to do, and then work closely with companies like the GLA and commissioning authorities to get some shared learning and some collaboration together to ensure that we're all learning from each other and learning from each other's mistakes and also from our findings. So it's certainly something that action should be taken now, but I can see that it being going for a very long time.
Well, this is a good start. It's worth it. Thanks for doing this, for hosting this. And I was quite frank with you, going, do we do this? Is this just PR? It's not just PR. To
be honest.
Yeah, it's not. And it is about making things better. And I thank and salute every one of you in terms of actually turning this into action. So the recording of this will go out. I'm amazed the participants, everyone has stayed. You're awesome. Thank you so much for staying. Some of you in that audience group will know Future of London, because that's maybe how you came to this. But on the Future of London page, there'll be more resources. Bala has already shared a few. Claire's got some. Joseph, when you can release it, I know you really want to tell us, but anyone who's got stuff, Nena, your competition, maybe we can put a page up there. And Yemi, you've got Paradigm that you're working with, or you're on the committee of. So anything we can share, we will. We want to help anyone who's on the procurement side to do better, and anyone who's working from a diversity perspective to get in and get a seat at that table and get things done. So those are the next steps from us. I think for now, I just want to thank everybody on the panel. Chloe's actually checked it a couple times, going, I'm really sorry, but we quoted her anyway. So thank you guys for your time. Best of luck to all of us. Let's get this started. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks.